This is a very special occasion for Voices from Oxford and Tea Talks, because in the discussion today, all three founders of Voices from Oxford from 8 years ago are here. Professor William Dutton, who used to be the Professor of Internet Studies here in the University of Oxford, in fact the first Professor of Internet Studies at the Internet Institute, and now the Quello Professor of Media and Information Policy at Michigan State University. We have Dr. Sung-Hee Kim, Professor at Seoul National University, and of course here in Oxford as Director of Voices from Oxford. We have me, Professor Dennis Noble, an Emeritus Fellow of Balliol. And we are here to discuss with Bill Dutton some very important questions facing the world today. And I think that you are going to start.
Yeah, it's great to have you today. And 8 years ago, we just had a meal at Balliol College, and then we launched it. Yeah, wasn't it fantastic? And thank you very much for all your support. And without your help, Voices from Oxford wouldn't have existed now. And now we are celebrating 8 years anniversary of Voices from Oxford. And then also, we just launched the Tea Talks. Well, as you know, we have interviewed so many distinguished scholars from all over the world, and the Nobel Prize winners and leaders. So when we approached some young scholars we really want to have an interview with, they said that, oh, I watched the Voices from Oxford videos, but you need to wait a little bit because all the interviews are too great. I need to grow more. So we really want to give more hopes, and we really want to inspire and motivate young people. So that's one of the reasons. That's the reason why we launched the Tea Talks. We really hope you will continue to give us support, even from America. 2016 was a strange year. Brexit happened in UK, and Trump has been elected in the US. As a consequence of this, lots of people, especially young people, think that the world is spinning, and they feel that they are losing opportunities. What do you think about it? What do you think? What processes do you think account for this?
Okay, that's an excellent question. But first, let me thank you for speaking with me and giving me a chance to say hello and find out what's going on with the Tea Talks and Voices from Oxford. I think it's just wonderful to see this continuing, and I do agree. It's I also am humbled to talk because I know some of the talks you've done, but happy to give my observations on from living in the U.S. during this period. It's been fascinating. I think it is in the U.S. they're constantly using the term unprecedented, and I think we are in unprecedented times. I don't think there's a comparable situation in my lifetime that I can call up. So I think that's why people are somewhat worried, because it's new. It's a very new and different situation, and there's a division of opinion, dramatic divisions of opinion, both in Britain around Brexit and in the United States around Donald Trump, and of course the events are big enough that we all sense that what's going on in the other country are important to us too. So the interaction of developments around the world, and of course Brexit and Trump's election are just reflective of many other shifts in opinion and surprising shifts that are going on across Europe and other parts of the world. So I think there's anxiety because this is so new, and because there's a clear reflection. I think people have suddenly become aware of how deep the divisions are in opinion about the present and where we should go in the future in both countries. I think people probably right now are in agreement that there's a divided country in both nations. But there's anxiety because I think people were surprised. Why were they surprised? I think it must be that the liberal establishment in both countries were in a bubble. They did not really understand the depth of dissatisfaction among many members of the public. So and I think there's a parallel. I mean, I may be trying to make too much of a connection, but I do think there was an effort to, in the U.S., they often simply refer to it as throwing the rascals out, which is getting rid of of the incumbents, politicians. And I think there's a way in which Brexit was a sense of we want change, or we don't want to continue. It was sort of a throw the rascals out kind of thing. And likewise, in the U.S., that was clearly a case. I do think in the U.S., and clearly in both situations, it's complicated by a lot of nuances. And I think in the U.S., there's a particular problem with the fact that the candidates for president in this election were both unfavorable, which was, again, I've never seen. So usually you have there's a division of opinion, but both candidates are viewed as somewhat favorable. And here we had two candidates that were unpopular even among their own partisan members. And I think that presented everyone with a choice of the lesser of two evils. And so that was a very difficult choice, and I think that made it a relatively surprising choice.
I enjoyed watching your Facebook posting during that time.
Oh, you did. Thank you.
Okay, over to you, Dennis. Any comments on?
Yes, I'd like to comment, Bill, on the unprecedentedness of it, to ask the following. See, I go back far enough to be able to remember listening to the news on the radio during World War II. I was old enough then to appreciate what my father and mother were listening to, anxiously waiting to know whether the world really had turned upside down. This was a period, of course, when the United Kingdom was facing possible invasion by the German forces in Europe, already occupying most of Europe, and when many people thought that we actually had to prepare for that. Now, quite a lot of commentators here in the United Kingdom, I don't know whether this happens in the United States, but quite a lot of commentators here in the United Kingdom see very strong analogies between the situation today and the situation of the 1930s. The analogies would be these. First of all, popularism becoming the political center ground, and extreme politicians taking over and taking advantage of that situation. Anger with many, many things, of course, building up with probably no absolute consensus, as you said earlier on, about precisely what was wrong. It's just that it was wrong. Something had to be done. And we all know, of course, what that led to. 6 million burnt or gassed, and it was terrible. Now, is it a fair comparison is the big question, I think. I mean, after all, as academics, we always say, you've got to learn from history, you've got to learn from the way in which nations and societies have developed. Do we actually, or is that a bad analogy?
No, I think it's an appropriate analogy, because I think that is a good comparator. Are we entering a period of any similarity? And I think I'm not worried yet, because I do think that, for example, there is an emergence of Donald Trump is a candidate that arose through arguably a populist movement. It is, in a sense, a bottom-up movement where he has a very strong group of followers, and
Indeed, yes.
24 million people follow his Twitter feed,
Yes.
and including me now, because I want to know what he's saying, and but it is a minority. I mean, even as president, he has the lowest favorability ratings of any president
Indeed, yes.
to date, and
Yes.
I think it's something in the nature of 45% of the American public are favorable towards what he's doing in the office.
Yeah.
So it's not a overwhelming. It's a minority, even as a president.
Which it was in Germany too.
Yes.
It was a minority initially,
And he was underestimated, and
he was completely underestimated, and nobody knew where he was going. You see, the analogies to that extent are quite strong, aren't they? And one big difficulty is, how do you know? Because people do not reveal the full nature of, now let's use the word, an evil program, because after all, that's going to lose you support. So it's always the case that the wolves are in sheep's clothing. Yes.
Okay, I have to now move on to the next question,
Okay.
otherwise
Yes, okay.
we'll never finish. Do you think Trump could have been elected in a pre-social media or online world?
Well, I think the social media and like his Twitter account was very important to him, and also Facebook. It turned out he and his advisors used Facebook data a lot to strategically decide where to campaign, where there were potential voters for his campaign, and they had a really intelligent election strategy based on using social media data. And understanding the electoral system in the United States so that they could get the electoral votes to win. However, I think the key was the commercial media more than Twitter. I mean, the commercial media gave Donald Trump, wall-to-wall coverage daily because he drew an audience. He had half the campaign money, maybe less than half of the campaign contributions than Hillary Clinton and the Democrats, but he had much more exposure on the media because anything he did, even his tweets, became news, and his anything he said or anything he did was the nightly news, and all the major networks and CNN and Fox News and all the news outlets would cover him because it was having news about Trump was guaranteeing them an audience. And I think it was the commercialization and the way it's ultimately the most negative thing I think about the commercialization of television news has been illustrated by this election, where they and that continues after his election. It's still every bit of news. Now, I don't know how that can be corrected, but I think that is one of the things that is blindingly obvious that we need to correct somehow in terms of how the commercial imperatives are driving news coverage in ways that are undermining quality news and fairness in news coverage.
That also is a comparison with the United Kingdom. The great majority of the printed press is in favour of Brexit. Yeah.
I'm going to ask, before I ask him about the US perception of Brexit, could you tell us about the British perception of Brexit? I mean, obviously,
Yes.
17 million people voted to leave, and including poor people and elderly people. And I remember that you cried after the referendum. Could you briefly talk to us about the British perception of Brexit?
Well, first of all, it's a completely divided nation. Fits exactly what you were saying, Bill, about the United States. First of all, divided between the nations of the United Kingdom. Very significant that Scotland voted very strongly for remaining in the EU. So did Northern Ireland, which is dependent on the border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland being a EU border, not a border outside the EU. Very many things that are in the way in which the difficult situation in Northern Ireland and all the terrorism that faced us over a period of 30 or 40 years has been kept under control is because that border is now open. And if it were to be closed again, there would be real difficulty. So Scotland and Northern Ireland both voted very, very strongly to stay in the EU. So did London, Oxford, Cambridge, and the other big university cities in the United Kingdom. And that tells us a lot about what you were hinting at. There's a division also between young and old. The younger population voted very strongly in favour of staying in the EU. The retired population voted strongly to get out of the EU. Now, that tells us that we are a very strongly divided nation. There is no thing that now really unites the United Kingdom. So it's a very strong analogy, I think, with the situation in the United States. And it's difficult to see how this can end because both sides are utterly determined. There's no middle ground anymore. The middle ground is gone.
And Bill, after being the director of Oxford Internet Institute at University of Oxford for 10 years, and you have lived here for over 10 years, how do you compare? How does the U.S. perception of Brexit compare with the British perception of Brexit?
Well, of course, we're nowhere as much involved, so that most Americans don't. For example, I don't know if most Americans understand the nuances between Scotland and Northern Ireland and the complexities that Brexit introduces for the Irish borders and how the Scottish independence movement plays into this and so forth. But I do think Brexit was well recognized in the U.S. and I think, unfortunately, it probably had emboldened many people, say supporting Trump, that Britain did these courageous things to actually do something dramatic. They weren't scared to do something dramatic.
And the French are now worried that may happen in their presidential election. The Dutch are worried about it too. And even in Germany, it's not at all clear that people like Angela Merkel can hold the situation. Exactly. So there's a domino effect occurring, isn't there?
Can't underestimate that. I think if Britain could do that, and people respect Britain and the opinions here and so forth, and so that the repercussions of that may have already been tremendous and could be more so. So I think, and also I think of course, the Americans have huge respect for Britain. I think they think they're not as worried about Britain as probably British.
I think that's right, yes.
Somehow we think I personally think I have so many experiences with how intelligent and the democratic debate and discussion is here, and the clever people in government and in office and the press and so forth, that there will be a way forward for Britain in after Brexit, and that the Brexit will be handled well in some way, if that's possible. If it is possible, you'll figure out a way to do it. But it is really a complex problem. Of course, it's playing into the current American politics dramatically. So, when we're talking about the relations between Donald Trump and Russia and Europe and Britain, all of this is becoming very apparent. And again, you don't know. Donald Trump, of course, was a real estate salesperson and wrote a book on the art of the deal, which he says is not as good as the Bible, but But he is a promoter of his work, pardon bar none. And but he is a very interesting aspect of him. You never know if people don't know if he's negotiating or stating his belief about where things should end up. But he's often criticizing NATO, for example, of being out of date. And does that mean he doesn't support them, or he does want more NATO nations to contribute more to supporting? And he says they're out of date. Does that mean he wants to leave NATO, or does it mean he wants NATO to reform itself and become more oriented to a terrorist crisis rather than fighting the last war kind of thing? So Brexit plays into that, and of course, as we follow what's done and how that evolves, and how the rest of Europe evolves, that's I guess this probably fuels your fears, Dennis, that the world is shaken up in a way that's not predictable.
And let's also put another perspective in this, because although our discussion has focused entirely at the moment on the UK, the USA, and a certain extent Europe, there is, of course, the Asian angle, which is extraordinarily important, because one of the other things that Donald Trump has upset is the situation over China and Taiwan, China and North Korea, China and Japan, and we simply do not know where all of that is going to lead to now. Because it's therefore not just the upsetting of the apple cart in the market in Europe and the United States, but also a very big lobbing of a bomb into the situation in East Asia. So it's worldwide, isn't it, that the anxiety and worries. And who would have thought that we would end up with a situation in which the great stability in the world might be China? And that it would be champagne in Moscow as a result of the election of a president in the United States.
Okay. In our post-Brexit world and the post-Trump world, and young people are getting worried about uncertainty. Any advice for young people?
Well, I actually think, almost directly in response to Dennis's comment, I'm less worried than, I don't want to be complacent, and I always want to be vigilant in terms of how things develop, but I'm encouraged by the political process in the United States. Over time, it has proven time and time again that presidents are relatively weak compared with, say, a prime minister in Britain, or Richard Neustadt wrote a book a long time ago about, it was entitled "The Power to Persuade." This was, he noted that when Truman was a president and Eisenhower was coming into office as a general and was going to become president, and he said, boy, does he have something to realize that when he gets in office, he's going to bark orders and nobody's going to do anything. That the office of the president is really limited by the power of the president to persuade the country to go one way or another. And I think even despite the first weeks of the Trump presidency being showing a lot of orders, executive orders and so forth, that can be done. Many of them are not executed yet. And I think as his cabinet gets into position and his appointees get into position, and there are more of this has to work with Congress and the courts and so forth, that the limits of the presidency will be to the benefit of a more incremental and sensible change that takes place. So I don't think the younger people and older people should be overly concerned. But I think they should be motivated to fix the problems that put us in this situation in the first place. And I think there's things to do, and not to try to rewrite history. You cannot redo the vote. You cannot redo the election.
That's true.
But you can make sure that the primary election process in the United States is reformed within the next 4 years. You can also try to work in ways to reduce the commercial imperatives of the media so that the commercial news is better reported. And also, clearly, I'm not as worried about fake news and with the social media and fake news as many people are, because that's always usually corrected almost immediately. It's usually the press that makes a big deal out of a fake news story, but we have to also deal with ways in which people are better educated and more critical readers of social media and social news. And what used to be the press, the fourth estate, we have to not just assume that they're becoming more partisan in the United States, and you have to have multiple sources of news, and be critical of all those sources. So maybe we'll come out of this a more aware and bright-eyed, of critical readers of history and the news.
It's very similar here in the United Kingdom. There are causes for optimism in the way in which Parliament is beginning to take back some of its powers to control and nuance the various ways in which, for example, the Brexit situation is handled. And you can see similar things in the way in which some of the media are handling things. So I think the causes for optimism are there. And in every crash, there are opportunities, aren't there?
And when we are in difficult situations, we have to turn things around, as you always said. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
So keep going.
Keep going. Keep going. Yes.
Thank you, Dennis. Likewise. Okay.
Thank you very much.